Welcome to another deep dive, this time into the world of Canadian food tech. You sent over this Food Tech in Canada 2025 ecosystem report. And I have to say, I was surprised by some of the findings. I know you're already pretty familiar with this space, so we can skip, like the Food Tech 101. But it seems like Canada's got this interesting paradox going on.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we hear so much about Canada being an agricultural powerhouse. And that's true, but the innovation happening beyond the farm, that's where things get really interesting.
Exactly. The report actually points out that while Canada is, like killing it in ag tech, we're talking 10th globally for the number of companies and 13th for investment. When it comes to food tech, we're not. We're not quite living up to our potential. And just to clarify for anyone listening who might not be as deep in this world as we are, we're talking about the companies tackling things like plant-based foods, functional ingredients, and food waste solutions.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's important to define these terms because food tech itself can be a bit of a broad umbrella. And you're right. In those specific areas, the report paints a slightly different picture. It's almost like a tale of two sectors. Within Canadian agri-food tech, ag tech is booming, but food tech, which actually makes up 75% of the companies in the sector, is getting a disproportionately small slice of the investment pie.
That's what I've found so fascinating. So Canada's 10th in ag tech. That puts us ahead of countries like Japan and Israel, which are known for their, tech innovation. So it's not like we're lagging in terms of agricultural innovation. But then the report says a whopping 44% of Canadian agri-food tech investment is going into ag tech compared to a global average of just 17%. That's more than double. It makes you wonder why that is.
It does. It does raise an interesting question. I mean, government funding for food tech in Canada is actually quite robust. It makes up almost 30% of the investment, which dwarfs what we see in places like the UK and the US. But where we seem to be falling behind is in venture capital.
Right, that venture capital piece of the puzzle. The report breaks down how critical those different funding rounds are for startups. For those unfamiliar, startups typically raise money in stages, with the earliest stages called seed rounds, and then Series A, B, and C as the company grows. And in Canada, while our startups are securing those early seed rounds, they're having a much harder time attracting those larger investments in the later stages.
Especially compared to companies in the US or DK.
Exactly. It's those later stage investments, particularly Series A, B, and C rounds, that are crucial for
scaling up
and taking a company from a promising startup
Yeah.
to a major player. And the report clearly shows that. Canadian food tech companies are getting significantly smaller investments in those rounds compared to their American and British counterparts. That discrepancy is a real roadblock. It almost feels like they're given just enough to get off the ground, but not enough to really take flight and soar. But even with that funding gap, the report highlights three areas where Canadian food tech is already showing some serious muscle. Plant-based proteins, those super sciencey, biotech-enabled functional ingredients and upcycled ingredients, and food waste solutions. Let's unpack these. Starting with plant-based proteins. I know this is a hot topic globally, but what's the Canadian angle here?
Well, in Canada, plant-based is more than just a trend. It's a significant portion of our food tech landscape. The report highlights that a full 25% of all Canadian food tech companies are in this sector, which is well above the global average. It seems Canadian entrepreneurs are really tuned in to the growing demand for plant-based options, and the market itself is already valued at a cool $1.7 billion USD.
That's huge. It's not just a niche market anymore. Are there specific companies driving that growth that we should know about?
Absolutely. There are over 60 plant-based companies in Canada. And what's interesting is that many of them are focused on the business-to-business B2B side, meaning they're producing ingredients for other food companies rather than consumer-facing products.
So Canada's not just making plant-based burgers, it's supplying the building blocks for the entire plant-based industry.
Exactly. A great example is Burcon NutriScience. They specialize in extracting protein from plants like peas and canola. And then there's the giant pea protein processing plant in Manitoba, set up by the French company Roquette. It's actually the largest facility of its kind in the world. These kinds of investments suggest that Canada is positioning itself as a key player in the global plant-based supply chain.
Yeah, that's a really smart move. It's like establishing ourselves as the go-to source for high-quality plant-based ingredients. But even with all this momentum, I'm guessing there are still challenges, right? The report must have touched on that.
Oh, there are always challenges. The report points out that production costs in Canada are on the higher side, which of course impacts retail prices and makes plant-based products less accessible for some consumers. And then there's the ongoing battle of perception. Some folks just aren't sold on the taste and texture of plant-based alternatives. So there's work to be done on both affordability and consumer education.
It seems like Canada's off to a strong start, but still has some hurdles to clear if it wants to be a true leader in the plant-based world. But let's move on to that. Second area of strength, the report mentioned, biotech-enabled functional ingredients. Now, this sounds especially intriguing. What exactly are we talking about here?
This is where things get really cutting edge. We're talking about things like lab-grown ingredients and precision fermentation. Essentially, it's about using biotechnology to create ingredients that are packed with specific health benefits or have unique functionalities that you wouldn't find in nature.
Okay. I'm going to need you to break that down a bit more. What exactly is precision fermentation, and why is it such a game changer?
Think of it like this. Traditionally, if you wanted to get a specific vitamin or protein, you'd have to extract it from plants or animals. But with precision fermentation, you're essentially programming microorganisms, like yeast, to produce those exact ingredients in a controlled environment. It's incredibly efficient, requires fewer resources than traditional methods, and opens up a whole world of possibilities for creating customized ingredients.
Wow, that's incredible. It sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie. So where does Canada fit into this futuristic food scene?
Well, the Canadian Foodtech scene is still relatively small, but it's growing rapidly. One company doing really fascinating work in this space is Solar Biotech. They're using algae to create plant-based proteins.
Algae-based proteins, that's not something you hear every day. I'm really curious to know more about that.
Yeah. It's really innovative stuff. Algae are incredibly nutrient dense, they grow incredibly fast, and they don't require arable land, making them an incredibly sustainable and efficient source of protein. And Solar Biotech is at the forefront of figuring out how to harness that potential. They're developing technologies to extract high-quality protein from algae and turn it into all sorts of food products.
That sounds like a company to watch. Are there other Canadian players making waves in the world of biofood tech?
Absolutely. Another company worth mentioning is Mara Renewables. They're focused on producing omega-3 fatty acids, but not from fish, which is the traditional source. They're using a process called fermentation to create vegan omega-3s from algae.
That's amazing. I know omega-3s are crucial for our health, but I also worry about the sustainability of getting them from fish. So it's great to see Canadian companies leading the charge and finding alternative sources.
It really highlights the power of biotechnology to create more sustainable and ethical food solutions. But even with all this exciting potential, the biofood tech sector in Canada still faces some serious hurdles, the report talks about. How the regulatory approval process for these novel ingredients can be quite lengthy, and the infrastructure required for things like bioreactors, where these ingredients are produced, is expensive.
So it's a classic case of groundbreaking technology meeting bureaucratic roadblocks. It makes sense that navigating those regulations and securing the funding for those expensive bioreactors would be a challenge, especially for smaller startups. But let's move on to the final area of Canadian food tech strength, highlighted in the report: upcycled ingredients and food waste solutions. This is something I know you're particularly passionate about. So tell me, what's happening in this space?
This is where it gets really interesting for me, too. Canada has a massive opportunity to be a global leader in this space, simply because there's so much potential raw material to work with. The report states that a staggering 21 million tons of food are wasted in Canada every single year. And what's even more astounding is that almost half of that waste happens during food processing.
21 million tons. That's just unfathomable. So we're not just talking about leftovers from restaurants and households, but food that's lost during manufacturing and processing. That seems like a huge area for potential improvement.
It absolutely is. There's so much perfectly good material being discarded that could be transformed into something valuable. And there are already some amazing Canadian companies doing just that. One example that I find particularly fascinating is Crush Dynamics. They're working with wineries to take the byproducts of winemaking, things like grape skins and seeds, and turning them into high-value ingredients for the food and beverage industry.
I'm intrigued. What kinds of ingredients are they making from those wine byproducts?
They're creating things like natural colorants, antioxidants, and even plant-based proteins. It's really impressive what they're doing. And they're not the only ones. Another great example is Comet Bio. They're taking agricultural waste, like corn stalks and wheat straw, and turning it into sugar.
Turning agricultural waste into sugar. How do they do that?
They've developed a proprietary process that uses enzymes to break down the complex carbohydrates, those agricultural residues, into simple sugars. It's a very efficient and sustainable way to create a valuable commodity. for materials that would otherwise be discarded.
It's like turning trash into treasure. I love that idea.
It's the very essence of a circular economy. And it's not just about creating new ingredients. It's also about preventing waste. In the first place, there are companies like Flash Food, which you've probably heard of. They've developed an app that connects consumers with grocery stores that are selling food nearing its best before date at discounted prices.
Oh, yeah. I've used their app before. It's a fantastic way to save money on groceries while also reducing food waste. It's a win-win for everyone involved.
Exactly. And then there are companies like LOOP Mission, which is rescuing ugly produce.
Yeah.
You know, those fruits and vegetables that might be misshapen or bruised, but are still perfectly good to eat. They're partnering with farmers and grocery stores to get that produce into the hands of consumers who are happy to buy it at a discounted price. They're challenging the notion that food needs to be aesthetically perfect and fighting food waste in the process.
It's amazing to see these companies tackling the issue of food waste from so many different angles, but I'm sure there are still challenges when it comes to scaling up these solutions, right?
Absolutely. These companies need more investment to expand their operations, and they need reliable sources of that waste material. There's also the consumer education piece.
Right, like getting people comfortable with the idea of eating food that's been rescued or made from ingredients that were once considered waste. Overcoming the ick factor, so to speak.
Exactly. But the potential impact on sustainability is undeniable. These companies are literally turning trash into treasure. So while there are challenges, the future for this sector is incredibly bright.
It sounds like Canada is
Yeah.
well positioned to be a global leader in the upcycled ingredients
Yeah.
and food waste solution space. So we've covered these 3 key areas where Canadian Foodtech is already demonstrating its strength. But what about the broader ecosystem? What about the investors, accelerators, and government agencies that are fueling this innovation?
That's a great question. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of this deep dive.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a quick break.
So we've been talking about these pockets of strength in the Canadian foodtech landscape, but what about the overall ecosystem? It seems like Canada has this incredible potential to be a global foodtech leader, but the report also hints at some roadblocks. It does, and those roadblocks are worth exploring. One recurring theme we've touched on is the funding gap, particularly when it comes to later stage venture capital. Startups seem to be getting that initial boost, but securing those larger investments needed to truly scale up and compete globally seems to be a bigger hurdle here than in other countries.
And it's like they get a taste of success, but not the full meal, as we were saying before. I wonder, though, is it simply a matter of not enough funding available, or is there something else at play? I mean, the report also mentions government support being strong, so it's not like there's zero interest in this sector.
That's an astute observation. It's not just about the amount of money, it's also about the investor mindset. The report suggests there's a certain level of risk aversion in the Canadian investment landscape, especially when compared to the US or even the UK. There seems to be a hesitation to back companies in emerging sectors like food tech, which are often perceived as riskier.
So it's almost like a double whammy for Canadian food tech startups. Not only is it harder to get those larger investments, but there's also a more conservative investment culture to contend with. I guess that makes sense, though. Food is such a fundamental need. Maybe investors are more cautious about disrupting such a critical industry. But the report does mention some other hurdles too, right?
Yes, beyond the funding landscape, there are also the regulatory hurdles to consider. Canada has a reputation for stringent food safety standards, which is fantastic for consumers, but it also means the approval process for novel ingredients and technologies can be quite lengthy and complex.
That makes sense. It's that classic balance between safety and speed. Consumers want assurance that what they're eating is safe, but that caution can also stifle innovation. It seems like a tricky situation to navigate.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's the ever-present challenge of geography, which we touched on earlier. Canada's vast distances and dispersed population make logistics more complex and costly compared to more densely populated countries. That's a hurdle for any company, but especially for startups that are often operating on tight margins.
So it's not just about getting funding, it's about navigating a complex web of challenges that are somewhat unique to the Canadian context. But despite all this, the report also highlights some incredible opportunities for Canadian foodtech to not only survive, but thrive. Let's flip the script and talk about those for a bit.
It's not all doom and gloom. There are some definite bright spots. For one, Canada already has a stellar reputation for producing high-quality food. That's a valuable asset, especially in a world where consumers are increasingly discerning about where their food comes from and how it's produced.
It's like having a made in Canada stamp of quality that resonates globally. It's
Yeah.
something we can leverage.
Exactly. And that reputation extends beyond just the raw ingredients. Canada also has a strong track record in food safety and sustainability. Those are becoming increasingly important selling points in the global market, and Canadian companies can capitalize on those existing strengths to position themselves as providers of premium ethical and sustainable food solutions.
So building on those strengths, what else does Canada have going for it in the food tech space?
Well, there's our world-renowned expertise in AI and data science. That technological prowess can be a game changer for the food tech sector, allowing companies to optimize production processes, personalize food experiences, and develop cutting-edge solutions to global challenges like food waste.
It's about combining the best of both worlds, deep agricultural expertise and cutting-edge tech. It seems like a powerful combination.
It is. And then, of course, there's the strong government support we talked about earlier. While venture capital might be lagging, the Canadian government has shown a genuine commitment to fostering innovation in the food tech sector through grants, funding programs, and strategic initiatives.
That kind of government backing can be a powerful catalyst for growth, especially in an emerging sector like this.
Absolutely. And finally, there's the growing consumer demand for healthier, more sustainable, and ethically produced food. This trend is global, but it's particularly strong in Canada, where consumers are increasingly conscious of their food choices
Yeah.
and their impact on the planet. It's almost like the market itself is creating the perfect conditions for food tech to flourish.
So it seems like Canada has a lot going for it. It's got the ingredients, so to speak, for food tech success. But how do we bridge the gap between that potential and becoming a true leader in this space? What's the secret sauce?
That's where it gets even more interesting. Many of the experts interviewed for the report emphasize the need for a more strategic approach to developing the Canadian food tech ecosystem. They talk about creating a more supportive regulatory environment, fostering closer collaboration between industry, academia, and government, and attracting more venture capital, especially for those crucial later stage funding rounds.
So it's not just about having great ideas and innovative companies. It's about creating the right conditions for those companies to thrive.
Precisely. It's about creating that fertile ground we were talking about earlier and making sure there's enough water, in this case, funding, to reach all corners of the ecosystem. The experts also stress the importance of developing a strong national brand for Canadian food tech. Promoting our unique strengths, like that commitment to sustainability and our high food safety standards, is key to attracting global investment and positioning Canadian companies as leaders in the global market.
Building that brand identity is crucial. It's about telling the world, hey, Canada is not just a source of great ingredients. It's a hub of food tech innovation.
Exactly. And finally, there's the need to invest in talent development. The food tech sector needs a highly skilled workforce, and Canada needs to ensure that it's training the next generation of food scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs who can drive innovation in this space.
It's about nurturing the minds that will shape the future of food. So to sum it up, it sounds like a multifaceted approach is needed. Strategic investments, policy changes, collaborative efforts, and a strong national brand are all key ingredients in this recipe for food tech success. But this conversation is highlighting something else for me. It seems like Canada's food tech journey is still very much in its early stages. There's a real sense of excitement of potential waiting to be unlocked.
I agree. There's a real sense of momentum building in the Canadian food tech scene, and the next few years will be crucial in determining whether Canada can capitalize on this momentum and secure its place as a global food tech powerhouse.
And this brings us to the final section of our deep dive. The report touched upon a few specific companies that are making waves in the Canadian food tech ecosystem. It's like a sneak peek into the future of food.
It is, and some of these companies are doing truly remarkable things. Let's dive into a few examples, shall we?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
I'm eager to hear what's cooking in Canadian food tech kitchens, both literally and figuratively. We've been digging deep into this Canadian food tech scene, exploring those companies, pushing boundaries, and those systemic factors that could help or hinder their progress. But now I'm curious to step back, look at the bigger picture. What happens if Canada gets this right? If we manage to nurture this budding food tech sector, and it really takes off, what could that mean for the country and maybe even beyond?
That's the question, isn't it? It's about connecting those individual innovations to a larger impact. What are the ripple effects of a thriving Canadian food tech sector? I think we can look at this through a few different lenses. Economic, environmental, societal.
Let's start with the economic side. It seems pretty obvious that a booming new industry would create jobs and attract investment, but how significant could that impact be?
The report paints a picture of a whole new economic engine for Canada, one that could generate billions of dollars in revenue and countless new jobs. And what's interesting is that this growth wouldn't necessarily be concentrated in major urban centers.
Right, because so much of food tech is rooted in agriculture, which of course is happening across the country.
Yeah.
Not just in big cities.
Exactly. Many of these food tech innovations are happening in rural areas, close to.
Yeah.
Where food is produced. That could mean revitalized rural communities, new job opportunities in regions that have been traditionally reliant on agriculture, and ultimately a more balanced
And sustainable economic answer.
It's a really compelling vision. It's not just about economic growth. It's about creating opportunities in every corner of the country. And speaking of sustainability, what about the environmental implications of a successful Canadian food tech sector? We talked about individual companies focused on sustainability. But could there be a larger impact? Absolutely. Sustainability is woven into the very fabric of food tech. These companies are developing alternative proteins with lower environmental footprints, finding ways to reduce food waste and creating more efficient and resilient food production systems. They're using technology to fundamentally change how we interact with our food system, and that has huge potential to mitigate the negative impacts of food production on the planet.
So we're talking about a future where food production is no longer a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, where we're wasting far less food, and where our food systems are better equipped to handle the challenges of climate change. Yeah, it's almost hard to fathom how different that world would be.
It is a profound shift, but one that's within reach. And beyond those economic and environmental benefits, there's also the potential for food tech to improve food security, both here in Canada and globally.
I can see how that connection might not be immediately obvious. How does a more innovative food tech sector in Canada translate to greater food security?
It comes down to efficiency and access. If we can develop more efficient and sustainable ways to produce food and do it closer to where people live, we can ensure more people have access to affordable, nutritious food. Food tech innovations could help address issues like food deserts, where access to fresh food is limited, and malnutrition, which is often linked to poverty and lack of access to diverse, nutrient-rich foods.
So it's about democratizing access to good food, ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to nourish themselves and their families. It's amazing to think that something as innovative as, say, lab-grown meat or algae-based protein, that's such a character impact on people's lives.
And that's just impact, the tip of the iceberg. Beyond those, larger scale impacts.
I'm fascinated by the potential for food tech to transform our personal relationship with food.
We've already talked about that ick factor and how consumers need to get on board with some of these new ideas. But how else could food tech change how we think about an experience? Well, think about the rise of personalized nutrition. Technology allows us to tailor our food choices to our individual needs and preferences. Imagine a future where we have an even deeper understanding of how the food we eat impacts our health. We could be making more informed food choices, and food could become an even more powerful tool for individual well-being.
It's about moving beyond just consuming food to understanding its potential to heal, nourish, and even delight us in ways we haven't even imagined yet.
Exactly. So as you can see, the ripple effects of successful Canadian food tech sector are vast and far-reaching. They touch on our economy, our environment, our society, and even our personal relationship with food itself.
It's inspiring to think about. This deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least. We've covered so much ground, the innovations, the companies leading the charge, the challenges, the opportunities, now this vision of what the future could hold.
And what I find particularly exciting is that this journey is just beginning. We're still in the early stages of exploring the potential of food tech, and the possibilities are truly endless. It's an open invitation to imagine, to innovate, to create a food future that's better for everyone.
And as this deep dive has shown us, Canada has all the right ingredients to be a leader in that movement. We've got the talent, the resources, the government support, and a growing consumer awareness of the importance of sustainability and innovation in the food system. It's a powerful combination.
It is, but as we've discussed, it's not just about potential. It's about action. It's about making strategic investments, fostering collaboration, and creating a supportive environment where these innovative ideas can flourish. And on a more individual level, it's about each of us taking an interest, learning more, and making conscious choices about the food we buy and consume.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about, and hopefully it's done the same for you listening. It's clear that Canadian food tech is at a crossroads, and the choices we make now will have a significant impact on the future of food, both here in Canada and around the world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery into the world of Canadian food tech.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deeper.